Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're celebrating a birthday, albeit a few days late. When it comes to bad graphics cards, there are two releases that really stand out to me. The first is the DDR4 version of the popular low-end GT 1030, and the second is this, the GTX 1630. It's not just me though, this thing got slated in reviews. Launched on the 28th of June 2022, this, what I called a 1030 successor, offered similar performance to 2016's 1050 Ti for what was about £150 to £200. In my original review, I said that I liked the palette version of the card, but the 1630 as a whole was just not very good, and it represented terrible value for money. Fast forward to June 2023 and prices haven't really changed. I've seen a few 1630s of various brands go for under £100 and US dollars, but unless you can find one for less than the cost of a second-hand 1050 Ti, these still aren't worth it. But as it's the 1630's first birthday, I thought I'd say a few nice things. I like that it's a PCIe 3.0x16 card, so its performance won't be held back further in older systems. I also like that we've seen some more models appear over the last 12 months without a power connector, and some that are low profile too. Ideal for upgrading that old Optiplex, but only if you can find one really cheap, remember. Furthermore, power consumption is very low, and there is overclocking potential here, which we've actually covered before. The 1630 has featured in a few videos over the last year, in fact, but today I thought I'd run it through a 15-game benchmark suite and see how it's holding up in some new and some very popular games. The following are all stock clock tests at native 1080p. It'll be getting no help from FSR today, and no help from DLSS any day because it doesn't support it. Now, I am still a believer of the saying there are no bad graphics cards, just bad prices, and I think if this launched at somewhere around £79 here in the UK, it certainly would have been a lot more popular and a lot more tempting, but it didn't, and it still isn't down to this price either. It can, however, offer at least 30 FPS in most games, over 40 in most in fact, and sometimes you'll even get 60 FPS if you manage your expectations, of course. First up we have Far Cry 6 at 1080p with the low preset and TAA. Here we were seeing 45 frames per second with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 37. So the average isn't that good, but there is definitely some consistency here when using the 1630, which by the way also has a 64-bit bus width. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 next, 1080p with a minimum preset. The only thing I changed was the resolution scale, which I set to 100% to maintain that 1920 by 1080 resolution. SMAA was set to T2X normal. 42 frames per second here with a 1% low of 28 and a 0.1% low of 20, so a few issues here and there, but overall I'd say this is still somewhat playable. Apex Legends at 1080p next with the high textures, everything else was set to lowest and TSAA was enabled. Here we saw at least 60 FPS, 63 was the exact number, with 43 as the 1% low and 41 as that 0.1% low. So again, there is some consistency here and overall that average was pretty good. I'd perhaps recommend turning the texture quality down a little bit as this is a 4GB card, but we are seeing at least 60 frames per second in Apex, which is definitely handy. I just had to include the newly released BattleBit Remastered because this game runs very well on the 1630 as you might expect. It runs very well on most hardware. Here with the Ultra preset and 100% res scale, we were seeing 149 FPS on average. There were a few little dips and drops here and there, but overall the performance was very solid and I could happily play this excellent game on this not so great card. For Forza Horizon 5 we're using the low preset with TAA enabled at 1080p resolution of course. Now Forza Horizon 5 I generally consider a very well optimized game, and here it's running with at least 60 FPS on the low preset, not very low, we didn't have to go that low, but with the standard low preset, even during multi-competitor races we are seeing a solid frame rate figure with consistent percentile lows too. Elden Ring did have a few problems with the GTX 1630, namely that we couldn't go any higher than the low preset and maintain solid frame rates. 43 FPS on average here, with a 1% low of 35 and a 0.1% low of 32. So not too bad overall. It's definitely playable, but I think you'd expect more from any card released in 2022, especially at the price point that it started to appear at. Spider-Man next, 1080p with the low preset, not very low, just low here with TAA enabled. Again, 46 FPS I think represents a playable result, but it would be a lot more of a respectable result if this card was a lot cheaper at launch and if it was widely available on the used market at a much lower price. But so far my advice remains the same, and that is that you should look out for a second-hand GTX 1050 Ti instead, of which you can find for £70–80, perhaps a little bit less if you are lucky. Next up we have Resident Evil 4. This is the demo version of the game at 1080p with the interlaced rendering mode and the lowest settings with TAA. We were seeing 47 FPS. Now interlaced rendering mode will give us a few more frames than normal rendering mode. The 1% and 0.1% lows were 36 and 35 respectively, so no issues whatsoever in terms of any stutter or slowdown. Again, it is playable, but we have had to seriously manage our expectations with this card and this 2023 title. The Witcher 3 next gen, I'd actually recommend sticking with the old version here or just switching to DX11, but I thought I'd try the next gen patch with DX12 and see how it held up. Again, I think 43 FPS is a playable result with the low settings and HBAO Plus enabled, but it's just that the price you still pay for one of these cards in 2023 doesn't really represent good value for money. In fact, it's still terrible value for money overall, unless of course you do get lucky on a really good second-hand deal. If it's a low profile card you're after, again there are low profile 1050 Ti's to be had also. For Hogwarts Legacy 1080p low preset, this one did better than I thought, 36 FPS, and the percentile lows were also pretty good. I was actually quite surprised by this result in all fairness, and again I think it's definitely playable, but we have had to turn things all the way down. Grand Theft Auto 5 next, I wasn't expecting any problems. The high settings with advanced graphics turned off here and FXAA gave us an 85 FPS average, which was more than playable, and the percentile lows were also very good here too. GTA 5, in my opinion, still holds up well graphically, and at these settings it looks good and plays fine on my 1630 system. We have The Last of Us up next. Now this does require FSR, as do all the other games really, in order to get the best out of the 1630, but this is a native 1080p test, and at native 1080p with the absolute lowest rock bottom settings, 25 frames per second overall, with a 1% low of 20 and a 0.1% low of 19. Yeah, not much stutter to report, and I did briefly test FSR with this game. I set it to quality mode and we were seeing about 34–35 FPS on average. So again, to reiterate, that is your best bet, but at native resolution, it's not really going to be playable, especially not in those intensive action sequences. Cyberpunk 2077 is up next. This seems to have lost a little bit of performance with the 1630 at stock speeds, but it does depend on where you are and what you're doing within the game world. I set the crowds to high, which is more of a CPU intensive setting, and everything else was at its lowest. We did just about see 30 frames per second, 31 in fact, and the percentile lows held up relatively well, though overall it's debatable as to whether you'd find this a playable experience. For Red Dead Redemption 2, definitely worth choosing the ultra textures, as anything else looks pretty muddy. TAA was set to medium, everything else was at its lowest apart from the geometry LOD and the grass LOD, which was set to max and 2 out of 10 respectively. 40 frames per second wasn't bad at all. In fact, it's a better experience than you'll get on any console, even still in 2023, so bear that in mind. But yeah, compared to most other graphics cards that came out in 2022, it's going to fall quite a bit behind. Finally then we have Fortnite, 1080p with a low preset 100% scale, not performance mode, just standard DX12 mode with this one, 79 FPS on average with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 10. A few little dips and drops as I do usually get in Fortnite with various hardware, so nothing really to worry about there, but overall the performance was playable if we stick to those low settings. There we go, the GTX 1630, essentially what is a cut down 1650, or as I like to see it, the successor to the 1030, still doesn't really make much sense purchasing in 2023 unless you can find it for less than the cost of a used 1050 Ti, and even better if you can find one that's low profile and doesn't require a power connector. As I've said before, I like this palette version. As always, they do a great job with the design of their cards. This one's also very quiet in operation, I should mention. But as a whole, the 1630 as a product, as a GPU, still not brilliant. Far from it. Thank you very much for watching though. I hope you've enjoyed celebrating the 1630's birthday with me today. If you did enjoy it, leave a like down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.